Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you all for coming to our event this evening. This is the most recent event in the Truman Legacy series. It's sponsored by the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Harry S Truman Center for Governmental Affairs, and most of them we partner with the National Archives and with the Harry S Truman Presidential Library and Museum. And we're happy to have those folks as partners because they bring a wealth of talent to us, and also the library provides opportunities for our scholars to go and do research there while they're here, which our scholar did yesterday. He was able to go out and do some research for his next book. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Samuel Walker. He was educated at the University of Delaware for his bachelor's degree. He got his master's and doctorate at the University of Maryland. His professional experience has primarily been as a historian for the United States government in a variety of capacities. He was a historian, U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 1986 to 2010. He was the associate historian, U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission 1979 to 1986. He was archivist for the Office of Presidential Libraries 1975 to 1977. He was an educational specialist at the National Archives in Washington 1977 to 79. He was an archivist in the Office of Presidential Libraries, National Archives of Washington, 1975 to 1977. He's also taught at Georgetown University and at the University of Maryland. He's the author of 8 books and editor of 2 others and a number of other articles. But I am going to read you the titles of some of these books because they attest to his expertise, but they also attest to his versatility. In 2011, at the University of North Carolina Press, he published ACC Basketball, the story of the rivalries, traditions, and scandals of the first 2 decades of the Atlantic Coast Conference. He said it was a kind of interesting diversion from doing history on nuclear matters. The Road to Yucca Mountain, the development of radioactive waste policy in the United States, University of California Press, 2009. 3 Mile Island, the nuclear crisis in historical perspective, University of California Press. And that book's in 2nd and 3rd printing, and in fact, it's been brought out in Japanese language editions. Permissible Dose, A History of Radiation Protection in the 20th Century, University of California Press. Prompt and Utter Destruction, Truman and the Use of Atomic Bombs Against Japan. Again, several editions in multiple printings, again in Japanese language editions. Containing the Atom, Nuclear Regulation in a Changing Environment, University of California Press, 1992. Co-author with George Mazelon, Controlling the Atom, Beginnings of Nuclear Regulation, 1946 to 1962. He also did a book on Henry Wallace and American Foreign Policy in 1976. His most recent book on nuclear energy is an edited volume published just this year by Truman State University Press called Nuclear Energy and the Legacy of Harry S Truman. And he did a book on American foreign relations as well. He currently serves as Distinguished Lecturer at the Organization of American Historians, and he won the Richard W. Leopold Prize awarded by the Organization of American Historians for the best book by a government historian in 2010. That was his Road to Yucca Mountain. I could go on even more, but it's clear our guest is well qualified to speak on this topic with us tonight, Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb and its legacy. Sam?
Thank you, Dale, and thank you all for being here. I thought since the Final Four just ended last weekend, I might talk about ACC basketball tonight. Dale told me I couldn't do that, especially here in Kansas City. So it's a pleasure to be back in Kansas City. I realized when I flew in yesterday that I hadn't been here for 19 years. The last time I was here was to do research at the Truman Library, and I came in April so I could go to Royals games. But I'll show you how much things have changed. Royal Stadium still had AstroTurf on the infield, and I called ahead to get tickets and for the first game that I wanted to go to, and I got a ticket in row 5 right in back of home plate. And I enjoyed that so much that I thought, well, I'll go see the Royals again, which I did the next night, and I thought, well, I probably won't get seats or a seat quite as good this time, and I didn't. I was in row 6 right behind home plate. And I suspect that wouldn't have happened if I had tried to go to the Royals game today. So it's a pleasure to be here. Everything seems up to date in Kansas City, and that's always a good thing. And it's a special pleasure to be here at the National Archives. I began my professional career as an archivist and an educational specialist with the National Archives. I never had the privilege of visiting the Kansas City regional branch when I worked for the National Archives, so it's a great pleasure to be here. My topic this evening, as we near the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, is Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb. This topic, I would argue, and I don't think I would get a lot of dissent, is the most controversial in all of American history. And I can't think of any other topic that has the intensity or the longevity of the controversy that has been carried on over the rightness, the correctness, and the morality of Truman's decision, which has gone on now with great nastiness, great intensity, and great intolerance, both among scholars and among the general public for at least the past 50 years or so. Truman's decision to use atomic bombs still creates enormous interest, as evidenced by the turnout tonight, I think, and also incites arguments among scholars and among members of the public that are notable for their nastiness. I'm probably not going to settle those arguments tonight, but what I hope I will be able to do is to increase your knowledge, one, of the context in which the bomb decision was made, two, the reasons that the bomb was dropped, and three, the big question over whether or not the use of the bomb was necessary and therefore justified. What I'm going to talk to you about this evening are, first of all, the two basic interpretations of why the bomb was used. I'm going to explain to you why I think both of those basic interpretations are incorrect. I'm going to tell you why I think the bomb was used, and I'm going to address the question which is the most important question, the center of all the controversy about the use of the bomb. The question is, was the bomb necessary? Was the bomb necessary to end the war as quickly as possible on terms that were acceptable to the United States and its allies? And it's that question that is at the heart of the controversy over Truman's use of the atomic bomb. Well, the older view, and is looking around at the crowd, this is probably the view, the interpretation that most of you grew up with. I know that I did. The older interpretation of why the bomb was used is that, and the answer to the question about whether or not it was necessary is yes, the bomb was absolutely necessary. And it was necessary because Truman faced a choice between, on the one hand, authorizing the use of the atomic bomb against Japan, and on the other hand, authorizing an invasion of mainland Japan that was going to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. And in this view, then, the use of the bomb was not only justified, it was necessary. It was the only reasonable decision that Truman could have made, because if he hadn't used the bomb, then the next step would have been an invasion of Japan that would have been enormously costly. And so in this view, then, Truman faced a stark choice, the bomb or an invasion. The other prominent view of why Truman used the bomb takes sharp issue with the traditional interpretation, and this is the so-called revisionist interpretation. And in the revisionist view, Truman did not have to use the bomb. He did not have to use the bomb because Japan had decided to surrender. Japan knew it was defeated. It had decided to surrender on the sole condition that the emperor be allowed to remain on his throne. And an unstated part of this interpretation is that the emperor could have remained on the throne as a kind of a kindly constitutional monarch. And so in this view, the use of the bomb was unnecessary. And since it was unnecessary, revisionists have come up with a number of explanations of why Truman used it. I mean, this interpretation insists that Truman and his advisors knew that Japan wanted to surrender, knew that Japan was ready to quit the war, but they elected to use the bomb anyway. And so the big question for the revisionists is, why, if Japan was ready to surrender, why did Truman use the bomb? And there have been a number of explanations for this, or answers to this question, but the one that is most commonly cited is that Truman wanted to impress the Soviet Union. Truman wanted to intimidate the Soviet Union. The Cold War was already breaking out. Tensions were growing between the United States and the Soviet Union in the wake of the end of the war in Europe. There were all kinds of issues that were dividing the United States and the Soviet Union, issues that were not easy to resolve. And in this interpretation, Truman, fed up with trying to get along with the Soviets, used the atomic bomb not to defeat Japan, because there was no military reason to use the bomb because Japan was already defeated and ready to surrender, but for political, diplomatic reasons to impress and intimidate the Soviet Union. So in this interpretation then, the bomb was militarily unnecessary. It was used for reasons that didn't have a thing to do with ending World War II. The revisionists also insist that there were other alternatives to the use of the bomb that could have ended the war just as quickly and maybe even more quickly than the use of the atomic bomb. So you see we have two sharply contrasting interpretations, and these are the two polar views of why the bomb was used, but it's at the poles that the controversy has been fought. And when there are newspaper and other articles and news programs on this issue, probably will happen in August at the time of the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima. Those are the views that you're going to hear. Let me talk for a second about the alternatives to the use of the bomb. One would have been to modify the U.S. demand for unconditional surrender, which was a policy that Truman had inherited from Roosevelt, by allowing the emperor to remain on the throne. And according to the revisionist interpretation, this would have been enough. That's all the Japanese wanted. And so for a minor concession, we could have ended the war very quickly. Another alternative was to wait for the Soviets to enter the war by invading Manchuria. As you might recall, there were large Japanese armies stationed in Manchuria. They'd been there since 1931, when the Japanese had overtaken Manchuria. And Stalin had promised FDR at Yalta, January of 1945, that within 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, that Stalin would send his armies into Manchuria. And this was a desirable step for the U.S. because it would mean that Soviet troops would tie down large numbers of Japanese troops in Manchuria, who then could not be transferred to Japan proper to fight against the Americans if an invasion became necessary. So in the revisionist interpretation then, if we just waited for the Russians to come in, that would have been enough to end the war in itself, probably. The other way in which the war could have ended without using the atomic bomb would have been to continue the conventional bombing, that is, the non-atomic bombing of Japan. And you need to keep in mind that Japan, for months during the spring and summer of 1945, was being smashed to smithereens by conventional bombs, waves of a fleet of 300 bombers dropping so-called conventional weapons on the Japanese. There was very few. There were very few cities in Japan that had not been bombed by the time of Hiroshima, and the death and destruction from the so-called conventional bombing was horrific. And we sometimes lose sight of that because of all the focus on the atomic bomb. But we have to keep in mind that we had been bombing the daylights out of Japan for months, and that the toll, the death toll, and the toll of destruction in Japan was horrendous. And yet the Japanese had not surrendered. But one way of ending the war, at least according to some of Truman's military advisors, would be to step up the conventional bombing along with tightening the blockade. There was a very stringent naval blockade that was depriving Japan of basic elements of life, including food and oil and other staples that they needed for the nation's sustenance. So at some point it's reasonable to assume that conventional bombing and the blockade would have forced a Japanese surrender, but there's no way of knowing that for certain. Okay, so let me talk some about problems with the traditional interpretation. The fundamental problem with the traditional interpretation, this view that most of you and I grew up with, is that Truman did not face a stark choice between the atomic bomb on the one hand and an invasion on the other hand. Keep in mind the invasion was not scheduled to begin until November 1st, 1945, and these other alternatives or a combination of them might well have forced a Japanese surrender before an invasion began. So the idea that for Truman it was a categorical choice simply doesn't hold water, and it surprises me that there are still scholars out there who contend that it does. It's simply wrong to set up this dichotomy between Truman having to use the bomb and Truman having to authorize an invasion. One major problem, in my view, of the traditional interpretation is that traditional scholars, on the whole, have not really examined the other alternatives, the other ways in which the war could have ended, and they have not provided any real analysis of why the bomb seemed like a better alternative, which it did. Why was the bomb a better alternative than continuing or stepping up conventional bombing and blockade? Why was the bomb better in the minds of Truman and his advisors than waiting for the Soviets to invade? Or why was the bomb better than offering the Japanese an opportunity to keep the emperor on his throne? So this is a very strong, I started to say strong weakness, and I guess I shouldn't say that. A very strong problem, a very deep problem with the traditional interpretation. Another problem is that the invasion was not inevitable. Read the documents from the summer of 1945 and in Truman's diary and in other sources and in documents that military leaders were exchanging among themselves and with the president and with others. They talked about the invasion as a contingency, something that they dreaded, something that they didn't want to do. But in Marshall's mind and in the minds of other military leaders, it was better than the other alternatives. So Truman, at a meeting on June 18th, 1945, authorized an invasion beginning around November 1st of the southernmost of the main Japanese islands, the island of Kyushu. But Truman and others, when they talked about the invasion, talked about it as a conditional event, something that might happen, might have to happen. Hopefully it wouldn't have to happen. But there was nobody that I have seen or read documents from who was saying an invasion is inevitable. I mean, it was a dreadful prospect. It was something to be avoided at all costs, if possible. But no one was saying that an invasion is necessarily going to happen to force a Japanese surrender. Another strong weakness with the revisionist interpretation. And finally, the whole question of casualty estimates. I have not seen any evidence, and most scholars who have worked as sources agree with me, that Truman was never told in the summer of 1945 that if an invasion became necessary, that it was going to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. There is just simply no documentary evidence that provides any convincing proof that anyone in a position of authority told Truman in the summer of 1945, Mr. President, if we have to authorize an invasion, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. This is something that arose after the war. It arose on the part of Stimson, Secretary of War Stimson, Truman, and others who were trying to explain why the bomb was used. But if you look at the contemporary evidence, there is really no convincing evidence that anyone in a position of authority or knowledge advised Truman that the cost of an invasion would be hundreds of thousands of American lives. Former President Hoover sent a letter or two to Truman in which he suggested that it might cost 1 million lives if an invasion became necessary, and Truman was concerned about that, and so he asked his military leaders to comment on President Hoover's suggestion, and he received a commentary back from General Handy, who was General Marshall's deputy, so he was very high in the military hierarchy. And he said, and he didn't know who the author of this memo was that Hoover had sent to Truman, but he said those estimates are entirely too high. So further proof that Truman was not told in the summer of 1945 that an invasion would cost staggering numbers of American lives, or that he needed to be told that. Okay, problems with the revisionist interpretation, and they are many and they are deep. The first problem is that we now know from Japanese sources, which have opened over the last 20 or 25 years, that Japan in fact had not decided to surrender. The emperor had not decided to surrender, and certainly his own government was so paralyzed by indecision and by internal dissension and by conflicting views, sharply conflicting views about what should happen. Should Japan keep fighting? Should Japan sue for surrender on the basis that the emperor could remain? That was one point of view. The other, that was held by the militants within the Japanese government, welcomed the prospect of an invasion because the idea was we could kill enough Americans that we would get better surrender. And the militants, in fact, in the summer of 1945, before Hiroshima, were not talking about one condition for offering to surrender, that the emperor be allowed to remain on his throne, but 4 conditions, which would have been totally unacceptable. Those conditions included no occupation army, or at least a small occupation army, Japan conducting its own war trials, and something else that was, which I've forgotten, which is equally outrageous and would have been totally unacceptable to the United States. So the point is that Japan had not decided to surrender, and scholars who have looked at Japanese sources generally agree, overwhelmingly agree, and these are not all scholars who are fans of Truman by any means, but they agree from what the Japanese sources say that Japan certainly had not decided to surrender. And it's also equally clear that officials, high officials from Truman on down in the American government did not believe that Japan had decided to surrender. And this is the second major part of the revisionist argument, that not only had Japan decided to surrender, but that Truman and his advisors knew it. And there's an abundance of evidence that shows clearly that neither Truman nor his chief advisors were at all convinced that the Japanese were ready to surrender, with good reason, because the Japanese had not made that decision. So the two main points, the two main crutches of the revisionist position have been refuted. That is, the one argument that Japan had decided to surrender, that cannot be supported, and that Truman and his advisors knew that they had decided to surrender, that also cannot be supported. Another problem with the revisionist interpretation is that scholars of this persuasion are much more certain than Truman and his advisors ever could have been that these other options would have ended the war. There has been a strong argument by many revisionists that if only the United States had decided or had made an offer to the Japanese that the emperor could remain, that the war would have ended very quickly. Again, scholars who have used Japanese sources don't agree with this. And there was strong reason why officials in Washington feared making that kind of an offer to the Japanese. And the greatest fear was that if we notify the Japanese government in some manner that they could keep the emperor, that this would support the arguments of the militants that if we hold out, if we keep killing Americans, if we continue fighting the war to the best of our ability, the Americans will weaken their demands, and we can get better surrender terms if we hold out. And so there was concern that there was a major concern that offering to retain the emperor could backfire. There were problems with waiting for the Soviets to enter the war against Japan by invading Manchuria. There were two problems with that. One was that it would increase Soviet strength in East Asia. The other problem was that most American officials, high officials, did not believe that this was going to end the war very quickly. And they might well have underestimated the importance of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in convincing the Japanese government to surrender. But the fact remains that they viewed it as something that was helpful. They viewed it as something that would tie down Japanese troops, but they did not view it in itself as enough, as having enough power to force the Japanese to surrender. Continuing the bombing, tightening the blockade, had been going on for 6 months or more by the time the bomb was dropped, and the Japanese had not decided to surrender. In fact, the militants within the government kind of thought it would be okay if the Americans invaded, and if it killed, several million Japanese citizens, well, that was too bad. I mean, it's shocking how cavalier they were about the cost of an invasion for the Japanese people, and even more so how cavalier they were about the enormous deaths and destruction that had already resulted from American bombings of Japan. And in terms of an option for ending the war, there was no guarantee. No one could be certain how long the war would go on using what had not worked for the past 6 months or so. So there were high officials within the American government who were convinced that yes, eventually the Japanese will have to surrender, but no one knew exactly how long that would take. So there was enormous concern, and that's why I say the revisionists can be much more certain 50 years later than Truman and his advisors could have been about the impact of these alternatives in the summer of 1945. Another major problem with the revisionist position is that they underestimate Truman's commitment, his #1 commitment to ending the war as quickly as possible. Revisionists tend to argue that, well, if it's true, as it is, that no one told Truman in the summer of 1945 that not using the bomb would cost 100,000 American lives, therefore it must be true that the bomb was not necessary because it might have only saved 50,000 American lives. And this argument is fallacious because Truman's commitment was to end the war as quickly as possible, to save American lives by ending the war, and to get American soldiers and sailors and Marines out of the war zone by ending the war as quickly as possible. Truman did not have to be told in the summer of 1945 that using the bomb would save 100,000 American lives or hundreds of thousands of American lives. What he cared about was ending the war as quickly as possible, no matter how many American lives it sold. His goal, and the goal of his chief advisors, was to end the war, bring the boys home as quickly as possible, make certain that Japan is defeated, but bring the soldiers home. And nobody had to tell him that using the bomb would save hundreds of thousands of lives. If somebody, and this is an imaginary conversation, but I hope it makes the point. If somebody had said to Truman in the summer of 1945, Mr. President, if you don't use the atomic bomb, it's going to cost 200,000 American lives. And he said, well, then we have to use it. Mr. President, if you don't use the bomb, it's going to cost us 50,000 American lives. 50,000 is a huge number. And Truman would have said, use it. Mr. President, if you don't use the bomb, it's going to cost 10,000 American lives. 10,000 American lives is still a huge number. Use it, he would have said. Mr. President, if you don't use that bomb, it's going to cost us 1,000 American lives. Use it. Mr. President, if you don't use that bomb, it's going to cost 50 American lives. Use it. Mr. President, use the bomb or it's going to cost 10 American lives. Use it. It would have been a very small number. We don't know. There's no way of knowing at what point Truman would have said, well, you know, this is the most terrible weapon ever developed by man, which is what he called it quite properly in his diary at Potsdam. So he knew the destructive power of the atomic bomb. And I'm not sure at what point he would have said, well, maybe we should think about this. Maybe we should have a meeting and talk about the potential drawbacks of using the bomb versus the advantages of using the bomb. But I am convinced it would have been a very, very small number because that's what Truman cared about. Truman was a former artillery captain who wrote to Bess after the war was over in Europe in 1918 that one of his soldiers had died of the flu or pneumonia or something. And he said, I cried like a baby. And that kind of attitude was still prevalent with Truman in 1945. So it's a major, major, major problem, a major omission, a major oversight on the part of revisionist scholars that they really lose sight of how important ending the war quickly was for Truman. And finally, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the revisionists, an unstated assumption on the part of the revisionists is that if the emperor had been allowed to remain on his throne, Japan would have surrendered. And they assumed that the emperor would have remained as a kindly constitutional monarch. When the Japanese first offered to surrender after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, and after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and they finally decided, well, it's time to surrender because the emperor decided it was time to surrender, on the sole condition that he remain on his throne. And as far as I can tell, the emperor's prime concern, his primary motive was trying to save the rear end of the emperor, but they did finally decide that. But when they informed the United States that they were ready to surrender on the condition that the emperor would remain, it was worded in such a way that the Japanese assumed, or at least hoped, that the emperor would remain as a divine ruler. Not as a kindly constitutional monarch, but as a divine ruler who had the same powers that got us into World War II in the first place, World War II in the Pacific. And this, again, is a major oversight on the part of revisionists. Okay, so I've told you why I think these two polar interpretations are incorrect. Why then did Truman use the bomb? Well, as I've indicated, Truman used the bomb first and foremost to shorten the war. That was his primary goal. That's what was at the forefront of his mind. That's what he was concerned about. That's what his major advisors were concerned about. And the bomb seemed the most promising way to do that. No one knew for certain that dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was going to end the war. The value of the atomic bomb was as shock weapons, to try to shock the Japanese into surrender. As I said, we had been bombing the Japanese cities for 6 months or more, causing enormous destruction. And that had not been enough to convince the Japanese to surrender. And no one knew how long that would have to continue before the Japanese would decide to surrender. So the major value of the atomic bomb was not its destructive power, but its shock value. That if we had this new weapon, if we destroyed Japanese cities with a single bomb, that maybe that would be enough to convince the Japanese that they had to surrender. And that's why Truman primarily elected to use the bomb. Again, no one knew at the time that 2 bombs were going to be enough. But the hope was that 1 or 2 or more, if they were necessary, would finally make the Japanese realize that the war had to end. The bomb was used with diplomatic motives in mind, but this was a bonus. Secretary of State James Burns was convinced that if we had the bomb, then he could kind of hold it out to the Soviets and hopefully make them more manageable or more tractable. Hopefully they would be more agreeable to our positions and our demands for what was happening in Eastern Europe and other areas of dispute. This was not a position or a goal that was very well articulated. I mean, it's never been clear to me exactly how Burns thought this would happen. If he thought that just the use of the bomb or having the bomb or showing the power of the bomb in some way was going to make Stalin suddenly reverse his positions or suddenly retreat from Eastern Europe or do other things that we would have liked to have seen happen. So it was kind of a vague sense that, well, if we have the bomb, the Russians will have to knuckle under. But it was not well articulated. It was a motive, but it was a secondary motive at best, and it was viewed as a kind of a bonus. Certainly Burns thought that it might work in his favor as Secretary of State, and Truman, as much as he thought about it, said, yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, that's fine. If the bomb makes the Russians more agreeable, fine, great. But that was not a primary motivation, and it was not something that really was considered very much except by Secretary of State Burns. And finally, another important part of the reason that the bomb was used was because of hatred of the Japanese. The hatred of the Japanese was deep-seated, it was widespread, and it was absolutely fundamental to our approach to the Pacific War. This is not to say that we wouldn't have used a bomb against the Germans if we'd had it in time. We would have. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But in fact, the American people, from President Truman on down, hated the Japanese so much that I think the effect of that might have been to forestall any real possibility of kind of re-examining the use of the bomb, reconsidering whether or not we should use the bomb, or at least considering what the drawbacks of the use of the bomb might have been. We hated the Japanese partly for racial reasons. We hated the Japanese because they bombed Pearl Harbor. We hated the Japanese because of their unspeakable atrocities committed against our soldiers and our troops, as well as other Westerners, and especially against Chinese. And these atrocities committed by the Japanese were much better known in the summer of 1945 than German atrocities. The Holocaust was still not to general public knowledge. And so hatred of the Japanese was an extremely important, and is extremely important to understand the war in the Pacific and the end of the war in the Pacific. But again, it's not the primary reason that the bomb was dropped. The primary reason was to try to shorten the war, and the bomb looked like a much more likely way to do this than the other alternatives. So I come back to my original question, which was the bomb necessary? And my answer is yes and no. Like on this question, and as I said, this debate gets very nasty, and it gets very personal. And on this issue, I hope it's clear by now, or at least will be by the time I finish, that on this issue I'm a flaming moderate, and I hope that my answer to this question makes that clear. Yes, it was necessary to end the war as quickly as possible. Yes, it was necessary to force the Japanese surrender at the earliest possible moment. Without the bomb, the war would have gone on longer. We don't know how much longer. It might have gone on for a few more days. It might have gone on for weeks. It might have gone on for months. But it would have gone on longer, and as long as the war went on, American soldiers and sailors were being killed. We know, we don't know how many. It wouldn't have been hundreds of thousands, but we do know that in July of 1945, the only month between the end of the grueling campaign against Okinawa, which ended in late June of 45, and the bombing of Hiroshima. We know that 775 American soldiers were killed in combat. We also know that another 2,300 or so died from other causes, accidents, disease, whatever. But they died because they were in a combat zone. So in the month of July 1945, about 3,000 American soldiers died because they were at war in the Pacific. And another, we don't know exactly how many, a fairly significant number of sailors died. You might have heard about the sinking of the Indianapolis, the American cruiser Indianapolis, which was sunk on July 28 or 29, 1945, before Hiroshima, when the war was still going on. And the death toll from the sinking of that ship was around 1,100. Sailors who died horrendous deaths from exposure from sharks, from the explosion of the ship. And again, this ship was sunk at the loss of life of a good part of its crew because we were still at war. So that's why I say the bomb was used primarily to shorten the war, and it accomplished that objective. No, the bomb was probably not necessary to force a Japanese surrender before an invasion became necessary. And here we come back to the point that Japan was teetering on the verge of disaster. They had no air force. Their navy had been destroyed. Japanese people were living on something like 1,000 calories a day. Japan was in terrible condition. It should have surrendered much sooner. Japan knew that it was defeated as early as the summer of 1944, but still didn't surrender. But my point is that things were so bad that I think it's a sound argument that the emperor would have decided to surrender before an invasion began in November of 1945. The emperor, at least his closest advisors, were also concerned about growing unrest among the Japanese people, who were tired of having their cities bombed, of having to ship their kids out to the countryside to protect them from the bombings, of trying to survive on 1,000 calories a day or less. And the emperor apparently was becoming increasingly concerned that the safety of his dynasty, his own position on the throne, might be threatened by internal dissent and the dissatisfaction of the American people. So you take a combination of these facts, plus the Soviet invasion, which occurred on August 9th, 3 days after Hiroshima. And it was a huge shock, at least for the Japanese militants. And so the Soviet invasion, along with the atomic bombs, brought a rapid end to the war. So that's why I say no, the bomb was not necessary to end the war fairly quickly. But again, if the war had gone on for another, say, 3 months until around November 1st, based on what we know the death toll was for American soldiers, and we add to that American sailors, in the month of July, you're talking about 10,000, 12,000 American deaths. And that would have been totally unacceptable if there was a way to end the war sooner. And no, I don't think the bomb was necessary for reasons which I have outlined. It was not necessary to save hundreds of thousands of American lives. This myth is something that came about after the war. So the use of the bomb for Truman was an easy and obvious decision. It's not something that Truman agonized over. It's not something that he lost sleep over. It appeared by far the best option he had to end the war as quickly as possible, he hoped. And in fact, from what we know now, the bomb accomplished that objective. Let me talk briefly about the legacy of Hiroshima, in part because I have done a lot of research on the nuclear power, but mostly because Dale told me to, so that's a pretty good reason. The legacy of the atomic bomb, the legacy of Hiroshima is mixed and ambiguous, and when I sat down to type out some notes and I thought about this, it occurred to me, and I think this is true, that the world would not be much different if the bomb had not been used. It was not the use of the bomb that produced such an important legacy. It was the development of the bomb and the successful testing of the bomb. Okay, the first legacy of Hiroshima was the birth of the so-called atomic age. Atomic age was a phrase that we used a lot in the late 40s, still used in the 50s and early 60s. Nobody uses it now, I don't think, or few people do. A few adult historians might use it. But the atomic age was a mixed image, a dual image. On the one hand, you had the mushroom cloud, which represented an atomic bomb that could and that had destroyed entire cities. And on the other hand, there were projected peaceful uses of atomic energy, and there were all kinds of what were then and seem now to have been ridiculous proposed uses of atomic energy, peaceful uses of atomic energy. They included atomic airplanes. In fact, the government spent a lot of the federal government spent a lot of money trying to build an atomic airplane in the 1950s and 60s and finally gave up. Atomic trains, atomic automobiles. You would get great mileage. You wouldn't have to stop at a gas station very often as long as your reactor was charged. There were talk about each individual home having its own small reactor to produce heat and air conditioning, and even talk, and I can't conceive how this would work, but individuals would be wired with an isotope of some kind, and that would keep you warm in the cold weather and cool in the warm weather. I don't know how that was going to work, but there were all kinds of proposed ideas, most of which made no sense at all, and which of course did not come about. The major legacies of Hiroshima in terms of the peaceful uses of atomic energy, one are radioisotopes, which have provided enormous benefits in medicine, in agriculture, in industry, in research, and in a myriad of applications, and you don't hear about that much, but the widespread production and use of radioisotopes was made by the development of atomic fission. And the other major legacy in terms of the peaceful uses of atomic energy is nuclear power, which provides about 20% of our electrical power at this time. Second legacy of Hiroshima was a nuclear arms race, or is a nuclear arms race. This was labeled by Churchill as a balance of terror, that is the effort by both the United States and the Soviet Union in the wake of World War II to develop bombs, to improve bombs, to build more bombs, and to have more bombs than the other. By the 1970s, the goal was not so much nuclear superiority as it was parity. But the fact remains that the nuclear arms race and all that it implied in terms of the balance of terror and in terms of costs was a major legacy of the development of the bomb. But again, I think the arms race, the nuclear arms race, would have occurred whether or not the bomb had ever been used against Japan. Stalin probably knew more about the bomb than Truman did, certainly at the time of Hiroshima, because Stalin was well informed by his own scientists, who were very able, and also informed by the information which was provided by atomic spies on the Manhattan Project. And when Truman learned about the successful test of the atomic bomb, the plutonium bomb at Alamogordo on July 16th, 1945, and word was sent to Truman right away through Stimson, And Truman said this is the most terrible weapon ever developed. I mean, as I said earlier, he was clearly aware of what the implications were of this new technology. But he discussed with his advisors whether or not he should tell Stalin about it. I mean, we were still allies. We still wanted Russia in the war against Japan at that point, though we were hedging on that. And eventually what was decided was that Truman would tell Stalin about it, but in vague terms. So hopefully Stalin wouldn't ask any questions. So after one of the sessions at Potsdam a couple days later, Truman kind of ambled up to Stalin and said, well, we have this powerful new weapon. And Stalin appeared indifferent, and he kind of smiled and said, well, I hope you put it to good use against the Japanese. And Truman and his advisors who were watching this very carefully were convinced that Stalin didn't know what Truman was talking about. In fact, we now know that Stalin knew exactly what Truman was talking about, knew exactly that Truman was talking about the successful test of the atomic bomb. And as soon as Stalin went back to his villa after that meeting at Potsdam, he ordered his scientists to step up their efforts to build an atomic bomb. In fact, he ordered them to build an atomic bomb as quickly as possible, and if they failed, he threatened to execute them. So Russian scientists had great incentive to produce the bomb as quickly as possible. And they succeeded. By August, September, sometime in 1949, by the fall of 1949, the Russians had exploded their first atomic bomb. It was a plutonium bomb, which is more difficult to build than a U-235 bomb, which is what the Hiroshima bomb was. And that set off a huge arms race, and we all know about the arms race. The arms race took on an entirely new dimension then within a very short time when both the United States and the Soviet Union developed a hydrogen bomb. And you always have to keep in mind that the hydrogen bomb is potentially at least 1,000 times or more powerful than the bombs that were used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs that were used against Japan were small and they were primitive. So when we talk about a nuclear arms race, when we talk about the possibility of cities being attacked with atomic weapons, we are talking about weapons that are enormously more powerful than the ones that wiped out most of 2 Japanese cities. And certainly this is a legacy of the atomic age. But again, it's not necessarily a legacy of Hiroshima. It's more a legacy of the successful development of the atomic bomb. Okay, and we're running out of time, and I don't want to go on at length about this, but a third legacy is public knowledge of and fear of radiation. And clearly, to the surprise of American scientists who didn't expect many deaths at Hiroshima and Nagasaki from radiation, because the assumption was that anyone who was in the path of the bomb would die from heat and blast and not from radiation. Well, that turned out not to be the case, and we know that a fair number of Japanese in the 2 atomic cities died from acute exposure to radiation. And there have been estimates of perhaps 10 to 15% of those who died promptly is the official term, who died quickly from the atomic attacks. Perhaps 10 or 15% died from acute exposure to radiation. And that's something that we need to be aware of. But the problem is that the distinction between acute exposure to radiation and exposure to low levels of radiation is often lost in the process. And as an example, every August 6th and August 9th or so, the Japanese tend to read lists of all those who died of cancer with the implication, or the statement, I'm not sure which, that all these people died from cancer from exposure to radiation from the atomic bombs. Well, in fact, the first American and now Japanese scientists have done careful studies of this and have concluded or calculated how many excess deaths there have been from cancer, leukemia, and non-cancerous diseases in the 2 atomic cities. And by excess deaths, what they mean are the number of deaths that exceed what the normal expectation of fatalities from cancer would be in those 2 cities. So anything above the expected level is attributed to radiation from the bomb. And they have studied a cohort of about 87,000 survivors in the 2 atomic cities, and whose average exposure was not acute. It was in a range of what is allowed for workers who work in nuclear power plants or around other sources of radiation in this country. And what they have concluded, at least the latest figures that I have, is in a period of about 50 years, the number of excess deaths at Hiroshima and Nagasaki from cancer, from solid tumors, and from leukemia is in the range of 540. And over a period of 50 years as well, the number of excess deaths from non-cancerous diseases is about 250. So you have excess deaths over a period of about 50 years in both atomic cities of about 800. And the point that I'm making is not that this should be dismissed. These are significant numbers, and they should be recognized. But I also wish to make the point that that there's no epidemic, that people are not dropping over from radiation exposure in huge numbers in the atomic cities. And I think that this is another myth which has taken on a life of its own, and there's a widespread assumption that huge numbers of people were killed, or have died from rather modest exposure to radiation from the bombs. And finally, a final legacy of Hiroshima perhaps is that it discouraged any further use of atomic weapons. Clearly, Truman was greatly affected by the first information he got of the effects of the bomb at Hiroshima. Stimson saw him a couple days after he got back from Potsdam, after Truman got back, showed him photographs of the destruction at Hiroshima, and also told him that it was estimated, no one knew for certain, it was estimated that 100,000 people had died like that. Truman went to a cabinet meeting either that afternoon or the next day and told his cabinet that no more atomic bombs would be used without his express authorization, because he said he didn't like the idea of, quote, killing all those kids. And so at that point, Truman really made his first decision about the atomic bomb, and that decision was based on the fact that he recognized that this weapon was something entirely different, and that the effects of the atomic bombs was so horrible that they would not be used again without careful consideration. Truman made statements to the same effect throughout the rest of his presidency, and he made clear that atomic bombs would only be used in the most dire of conditions. And when General MacArthur during the Korean War appealed for or demanded authority to use atomic weapons against the Chinese, Truman fired him quite properly, and MacArthur became a big hero, but Truman did the right thing. And every president since Truman has taken the same position, that nuclear weapons are more for deterrence than for use, and they would only be used in the most dire of circumstances. So it's at least arguable, it's not provable, that one legacy of Hiroshima is the lack of use of atomic weapons since then. Well, the atomic bomb is still a much discussed and a much argued about issue. We've come a long way over the last 20 years. We know now that I think we know beyond dispute that Truman used the bomb primarily to end the war. We know, I think beyond dispute, that the Japanese had not decided to surrender. There still are a host of minor issues that scholars argue about, and these arguments will still go on, and that is as it should be. The use of a bomb that killed tens of thousands of people instantaneously constantly needs to be reconsidered and re-examined, but I would argue that we need to do this on the basis of documentary evidence and not on the basis of ideology or on the basis of myths that have grown up and taken hold over a period of almost 70 years. And thank you for your attention.
Question?
Yes.
Let's get the microphone.
I'm hard of hearing. I had the honor of being in World War II in the Navy on Guam. And the question I have is, did we have additional atomic bombs other than the last one we dropped?
We were in the process, or we had the capacity to build more. The next one was going to be ready around the 3rd or 4th week of August. And then it was projected that we would have another 10 or 12 by the time that the invasion was projected to begin, if it was necessary. So we didn't have any more on hand, but we were going to have many more within the next few weeks after Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And again, I don't remember the amount that we lost each week, but if we'd have waited till one more was built, do they project how many lives we would have lost?
Well, no, not that I've seen. I mean, the only figures that I have ever seen that I based my judgment on was those 775 soldiers and an unknown number of sailors who were killed in July of 1945. And so I extrapolate from that, which is not a very reliable way of doing it, but it's the only figure we got. But if the war had gone on for another month, let's say, another, I don't know, 775 or more or less soldiers might have been killed. Sailors would have been killed. And that was enough for Truman to authorize the bomb.
Yeah, you dramatically put that by the amount of would it be plausible for this amount to all the way down.
Yeah.
But how many were killed by those two bombs in Japan?
Okay, and that's a good question. Hiroshima estimates run from 80,000 to 160,000 by the 1st of January 1946, within 5 months. Nagasaki ranged from 35,000 to 60,000.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this personally. One more question. Would it have been worth our while to use animals? I'm sure this has been promoted. A lot of animals on some island and test them with the dropping of that twice, say.
Yeah, let me talk about that just briefly, and I know there are more questions, and I want to give everybody a chance. There was some consideration of making a show of the power of the bomb by bombing an uninhabited island. And therefore, the hope was that the Japanese would see how powerful the atomic bomb was, and they would surrender. That was considered very briefly by some of Truman's advisors. And the conclusion was that it would not impress the Japanese enough to surrender. I mean, the Japanese hadn't surrendered when their cities had been destroyed by conventional bombers. So there was real concern about a demonstration just wouldn't be impressive enough to convince the Japanese. And there was also concern that, well, if we told the Japanese we were going to drop this new weapon on an island, that they would move American POWs there, which was a reasonable concern. So that was considered briefly, but not real seriously, because it just didn't seem like a good idea.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Sir, I'm Jeff Babb. I'm an instructor at the Command General Staff College. I really kind of take issue with your numbers of casualties. If you go back to April and look at the losses in the Philippines, the losses in Okinawa, the losses at Iwo Jima, and you count 2.5 million Japanese soldiers still in China, probably 4 million Japanese soldiers still in Honshu and the main islands, I think it is relatively easy to come up with 100,000 deaths, 500,000 casualties relatively easily. Now, I don't disagree with your thought that Truman wanted it ended and wanted it ended as soon as possible, but I really think that you're downplaying the numbers of casualties. The other thing, I don't believe that Truman had to be told. He was an Army officer. He'd seen the great destruction of World War I. I'm sure he had the casualty figures for the Philippines under MacArthur and for Okinawa and Iwo Jima. So it didn't take a genius to do the extrapolation on that. So that...
Yeah, well, the only thing I can tell you is that there was a meeting at the White House on June 18th, and that he was given casualty figures which showed that if an invasion of both Kyushu and Honshu, where the island where Tokyo is located, were necessary, and no one thought that the second invasion would be necessary, that deaths might be as many, American deaths might be as many as 46,000, and casualties 220,000. In fact, we also know that the Japanese succeeded in moving a lot more troops to Kyushu than what was anticipated at that June 18th meeting. So it's very possible that projected deaths might have been higher than were estimated on June 18th. And the costs were, the potential costs were great enough that the Army was reconsidering an invasion at all by early August of 1945. But my point is simply that the idea that, and Truman at times used the 220,000 casualties when he made post-war statements, but at other times he used 500,000 deaths or 1 million deaths. And so those numbers are very soft and very unreliable. But again, my point was he didn't hear about casualties in the hundreds of thousands, nor did he need to be told that to authorize the bomb.
I'm also instructor at Fort Leavenworth. My question is on the second bomb. You know, what was the deliberation? Because he said after the first one he didn't want to use it again, he didn't want to kill children, but obviously there was deliberations to drop the second one in Nagasaki. Can you talk about the deliberations at the highest levels with Truman that forced that decision?
Yeah, yeah, there were none. The order was given. I mean, we always talk about Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb. In fact, Truman never made a decision in which he said, we shall use the atomic bomb. The bomb was authorized by an order from General Handy, who was General Marshall's deputy. And the order, which went out, I think, July 25th or thereabouts, was probably never seen by Truman. And it said bombs will be used, the two bombs will be used as made ready. So there was really no consideration of, there wasn't much consideration of the first bomb. There was none of the second bomb because the orders had gone out. And in fact, the Nagasaki bomb was scheduled for August 11th instead of August 9th, but the weather reports were ominous, so they moved the time up. And there's still a lot of debate among scholars as to the impact of the Nagasaki bomb on Japan's decision to surrender. There's general consensus that the Hiroshima bomb was a major factor, had a major impact on the emperor, and it was Hiroshima that really convinced the emperor to that the time had come to surrender. But the second bomb, there just wasn't any consideration. The Japanese had not made any obvious move to end the war after Hiroshima, and so there was no reason to change the order. And some scholars have argued, well, you know, if we waited for a while, but those same scholars tend to be the ones who say that Japan was ready to surrender anyway. And if in fact they had been ready to surrender, then 3 days was plenty of time.
Dr. Barker, my turn.
Yes,
I'm not an instructor.
that's allowed.
Would have Roosevelt made the same decision at approximately the same time, do you think?
Yes. Roosevelt would probably have thought about it more. He might have agonized over it more, but I'm convinced that he would have made the same decision. All of his actions during the war indicate that he would have used a bomb. I think that he would have given it more consideration, but in the end, with no indication that the Japanese were ready to surrender, the bomb just appeared to be necessary, and I think that it would have appeared that way for Roosevelt as well. I'm speculating, but there's a lot of speculation on this topic.
Syed Hassan from UMKC.
Yes.
You talked about many of the legacies of the atomic age. One of the sad legacies, in my opinion, is the radioactive waste that is sitting around all over, including our state of Missouri and Kansas and other 39 states, in the so-called peaceful use of nuclear energy. Your book talks about Yucca Mountain, the road to Yucca Mountain. I would like to have your view on would Yucca Mountain become the repository, or still we are not sure where it will go?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me reply briefly to a question that I wrote a book about, and I still haven't covered. So,
would you let everybody know the title of the book in case they missed it?
yeah, the title of the book that I wrote on that subject is The Road to Yucca Mountain, and it considers radioactive waste disposal policies between the end of World War II and the decision to use Yucca Mountain as the repository for commercial waste from commercial nuclear power plants. Is there any easy solution? No. Is there any solution that's ever going to satisfy everybody? No. Are there solutions that would give reasonable guarantees that radioactive waste could be stored in ways that would not affect public health for tens of thousands of years? Yeah. The problem is that is hard to predict, and we can't predict. When radioactive waste disposal was first considered in the 1950s and 1960s and early 1970s, the idea was to put fuel rods in containers that would last 10 years. And then the fuel rod, the radioactivity, the intense radioactivity in those fuel rods would be exposed to whatever medium the waste was buried in. Salt was the most popular option during that time period. Now, with the latest proposals and the containers that would have been used at Yucca Mountain, they have to be stored in containers that last at least 1,000 years and maybe more, and the objective is to have them last for as long as the radiation in those fuel rods reaches a point where it's the same as natural background radiation. So that's the objective, and technically it's solvable, not in a way that's going to make everybody happy. Politically, at this point, it appears to be impossible. Yes.
Yes, the controversy centers around, the drop in the atomic bombs and the 200,000 or so people that evidently died as a result of that. But with the conventional bombing and the firebombing of Japanese cities, which had taken place for 5, 6, 7 months prior to that, we're also talking about a tremendous amount of death and destruction. How
Yes.
does the figures compare between, the people killed because of the atomic bombs and those killed through all the firebombing?
Yeah, the total of those killed in the firebombing would be much greater, and I don't know what the numbers are exactly. They're out there. I simply don't know. But for example, there was a bombing of Tokyo in March of 1945, a firebombing of Tokyo that probably killed in horrible ways 80,000 citizens of Tokyo. And we seldom hear anything about that. I saw a couple of articles last March where they talked about the firebombing of Tokyo. I mean, the conventional non-atomic bombing of Japan was horrible for the Japanese, and it's sinful that the leadership from the emperor on down were pretty much indifferent to that. What they cared about, what the emperor cared about, was saving his own rear end, and what the militants apparently were concerned about was, one, saving the emperor, and two, not embarrassing themselves by proving how incompetent they were to start the war in the first place. And I don't mean to be cynical, but it's awfully hard to explain their stupidity in any other terms.
Dr. Walker, we have one right here.
Yes.
My uncle was killed at Okinawa on a hospital ship by he was a doctor, by a kamikaze plane. How did they choose the city of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki? How did that choice come about?
Hiroshima was not a major military base. It did have troops there, and it was a base, but it was pretty much untouched, and it was left untouched for the same reason. The idea was to show, was to use the atomic bomb against a city that had not been heavily damaged by previous bombing, to show the effects and to increase the shock value. Nagasaki, in fact, was the second city on the list on August 9th. The weather was so bad around Kokura, which was the designated target, that the plane went on to Nagasaki and barely dropped the bomb in time to save the plane, which was out of fuel. It's the story of that bombing run is very dramatic, and Nagasaki had been bombed previously, and it had a lot of war industry. Mitsubishi had major factories in Nagasaki, but it had not been heavily damaged. And again, the shock value of the atomic bomb was the objective.
We have one more right here.
Doctor, I've read that there were those in our military leadership that were persuaded that I don't want to say mass suicide, but numerous civilian suicides in Okinawa suggested that there was not any inclination on the part of the Japanese to ever surrender. And I wonder if you could comment on that, and also on whether there was any serious consideration given or evidence of any serious consideration regarding just waiting them out through a blockade and seeing, starving them out to see how long that would have taken and whether that was seriously considered.
Yes, it was. Let me take the second part first. Yes, it was seriously considered, and no one knew how long it would take to starve the Japanese into submission. But the assumption was it would take several months at least. I mean, Truman said in his diary, you know, I've got this new weapon and the war will end a year sooner now. Now, I don't know who he heard the length of time of a year, but that was not unusual for thinking about how long the war would go on with continued conventional bombing and the blockade. And the first part of your question was?
The inclination not to surrender based on the mass suicides in Okinawa.
Yeah, yeah, there was great concern about the Japanese habit of fighting to the death. And in Okinawa, in fact, soldiers mowed down, slaughtered their own citizens, especially those who tried to surrender, including women and children. The Japanese were a very tenacious, and that's a kindly term, and there was great concern about the cost of an invasion. And when I say it wasn't going to cost hundreds of thousands of deaths, and those numbers were projected by military leaders at the time, I do not wish to underplay in any way how horrendous an invasion would have been, both for the invaders, both for the Americans who invaded, and for the Japanese people. And you know, we always have to keep in mind the context in which the bombs were used, because World War II was just a horrendous, horrendous, horrendous event. And estimates of how many people died during World War II run to 80 million. Those are very serious numbers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker.
Thank you.